So, of course, we do start in Perth. Fremantle up against St Kilda. The Dockers had to fight for it, but in the end, they were too good and ran out winners in the end by 12 points. 81 to the Dockers, 69 to the Saints. Now, getting to the game itself, and St Kilda started really well on the territory battle in the opening half of the first term. However, they did fail to capitalise on their momentum with only 3 behinds in the opening 10 minutes of the contest. And at the first break, Fremantle actually held a 3-point lead, with the home team kicking 2 goals to 1 in the first quarter. Now, after conceding the first goal of the second term, St Kilda were actually able to string a few together to regain the lead. Now, both teams did trade goals heading into the main break, with Fremantle holding a slender 3-point advantage once again. Then the Dockers did kick the first goal of the second half to put a handy break on the Saints. However, this seemed to just spark the away side. St Kilda were able to kick the last 3 goals of the third quarter, while Fremantle wasted so many opportunities down their end with 1 goal 5 for the term. And heading into the final break, St Kilda led by 8 points. And when the Saints kicked the first goal of the final quarter, they well and truly set the challenge down to the Dockers. But Fremantle weren't going to let St Kilda simply walk all over them. The Dockers kicked the next 4 goals to take the lead back, and despite both teams trading a goal each at the end of the game, it was Fremantle who did enough to keep their top 4 hopes alive somewhat, but their finals hopes are well and truly intact. So well into Fremantle, they got a really tough performance against the Saints, and they were able to stand up to it, something that they probably haven't been able to do sometimes in the past. So well done to the Dockers. And St Kilda, a couple of gallant performances over the last few weeks, but it's still another loss. And unfortunately, they just can't find that win as of late. But let's move to the statistics of this game, of course. On the multiple goal kickers for the Dockers, 3 goals to Tracy, 2 goals to Jackson. For St Kilda, Keeler was the sole multiple goal kicker for them with the 2. On the disposals for Freo, Clark with 31, 25 to Brayshaw, 18 to Sarong, Ryan and Johnson. For St Kilda, Wanganeen Miller with 28, McRae with a 26, 24 to Garcia and 22 to Sinclair and Steele. And finally on the AFL fantasy front for the Dockers, 122 to Clark, 107 to Jackson, 99 to Brayshaw and Darcy, and 88 to Erasmus. And for St Kilda, Marshall with the 112, Wanganeen Miller with the 109, Steele with the 93, 89 to McRae and 88 to Max Hall. Now before we get to the votes for this game, of course, we have to mention the members' vote for round 15. How the members vote works for you guys. For the review in 2025, a 3-2-1 voting system is awarded for every single game of the AFL season on the channel. And each round, players who receive 3 votes in the game have a chance to get a bonus vote. I will decide the 4 best players from the round, who will enter a poll exclusive for channel members to vote on, and the winner of that poll will receive the bonus vote for the round, the members vote. And at the end of the 2025 AFL season, every vote counts. So this is your chance to have your say on the 3rd ever Boundary Riders medalist. So if that appeals to you, or if you just want to show some extra support on the channel, then make sure to click the channel membership link down below and join in the fun. But for now, let's get back into the video. And the members vote for round 15 went to Fremantle ruckman Luke Jackson. But now let's get to the votes for this game. 3 votes Jordan Clark, 2 votes Rowan Marshall, and the 1 vote to Nasiah Wanganeen Miller. This is a massive game from Jordan Clark, having a bitty underrated season for mine, hasn't really been talked about a lot. But of course, he was the All-Australian halfback last year, and he continues on his great form. Had 14 intercept possessions today, 6 intercept marks from a guy who's not really that tall, 6 score involvements, and was one of the few players in the first 3 quarters who really could keep his head up high for the Dockers, so deserved the 3 votes in my opinion. Rowan Marshall was instrumental in the middle of the ground for St Kilda today. They were pretty dominant throughout all 4 quarters, if I'm being honest, especially through clearance, and Rowan Marshall had 10 clearances throughout the day, as well as 10 score involvement, so I think he deserved the 2 votes for St Kilda, and did really well to fight against 2 recognised ruckmen. And Nasiah Wanganeen Miller, I don't know what St Kilda are going to have to do to get him to re-sign, but despite being a halfback, he's one of the few players for St Kilda who is able to thread some kicks together and really work on their attacking game, so somehow St Kilda are going to be able to sign him. I don't know if they're going to be able to, but he was very good for them today as well. So the first game on Sunday, of course, was the Tigers up against Adelaide. The game pretty much went as most people would have expected. The Crows were just a class above in the end, winning by 68 points over the Tigers. 122 to the Crows, 54 to Richmond. Now, unfortunately, we did have an injury concern from this game, which was McKelty Lafau. Unfortunately, in his first game back since his season-ending ACL injury midway through 2024, he injured his calf in the second term and unfortunately was subbed out close to half-time. But getting to the game itself, and it was a hot start for the Adelaide Crows in the opening 10 minutes of the contest. The visitors kicked 2 goals and their opponents couldn't get their hands on the footy. However, as the quarter went on, the Tigers started to get their handle on the contest, and even though it still felt like Adelaide had a stranglehold on the game, they did miss some crucial chances heading into the first break. After kicking 2 goals 5 in the opening term, the Crows did lead by 16 points, but it should have been a lot more. Now, Richmond found their first goal of the game early in the second term as both teams did trade goals to the midway point of the quarter. However, Adelaide looked to break the Tigers late in the first half. The Crows piled on the last 4 goals of the second quarter to lead by 41 points in the major break. And if I'm being honest, there wasn't really much of a fight put up by the Tigers in the second half. Now, granted, they didn't let the game blow out by too much of a margin, but after we saw 6 goals to the Tigers compared to the Crows' 10 goals in the second half, it was really just a training drill for Adelaide as they keep their top 4 hopes alive. So well done to the Crows, but in the end, it wasn't really much of a spectacle, if I'm being honest. Not many people were expecting much from Richmond today, and Adelaide really just put them to the sword, got a nice percentage boosting win. So let's get to the statistics of this game, of course. On the multiple goal kickers for the Tigers, sole multiple goal kicker was Alger with the 2. For the Crows, Thilthorpe with the 5, 3 goals to Michaelani, 2 goals to Richelli, Walker and Curtin. On the disposals for the Tigers, Presti with a 29, 28 to Hopper, 25 to Banks, 23 to Ross, and 19 to Taranto. And for Adelaide, Miller with a 27, 26 to Curtin, Dawson and Laird, 24 to Worrell. And finally on the AFL fantasy front, for the Tigers, Presti a 120, Banks 105, 88 to Hopper, 81 to Taranto, 79 to Nankervis. And for Adelaide, Curtin with a 118, 113 to Hinge, 111 to Miller, 107 to Thilthorpe, and 105 to Jordan Dawson. But now let's get to the votes in this game. This was pretty tough, but in the end we have gone with Dan Curtin 3 votes, 2 votes to Jordan Dawson, and the 1 vote to Riley Thilthorpe. What a performance from Dan Curtin today. Just re-signed with the club recently, and he well and truly paid out in spades. 2 goals, 26 touches, played all over the ground, was absolutely instrumental for them today. He is going to be one to build off of for the next decade if they're able to keep him. So well done to Dan Curtin. Jordan Dawson was involved in so many of the scores for Adelaide today, so he deserved the 2 votes. And Riley Thilthorpe, a little bit tough to only get the 1 vote after 5 goals. However, he did get 3 of them in the final term to pad up his stats just a little bit, but still a very good performance from the big key forward. So on Saturday night, we had the Collingwood v West Coast game at Marvel Stadium. Collingwood not really liking playing at the smaller venue. However, they found a way to fight in the second half against the West Coast Eagles, who put up a gallant effort to win by 29 points. 88 to the Pies, 59 to the Eagles. Now, both teams missed a lot of opportunities throughout the opening term, but it was evident early that the Eagles are up for the fight. The West Coast won the territory battle throughout the first quarter, and honestly should have been further in front at the first break. However, the Eagles only led by 9 points. But it seemed early in the second quarter that the Pies had enough of the Eagles' fight as they kicked the first 4 goals in a row, and you could have been forgiven in thinking that the Eagles would start to drop off. However, the West Coast weren't going to drop away from this game without a fight, as they found another gear. The Eagles kicked the next 4 goals in response to regain the lead, and the scoring did dry up towards the end of the quarter, but at the main break, the West Coast led by 8 points. Now, similar to the start of the second quarter, Collingwood threatened to kick away at the start of the third. The Pies kicked the first 4 goals of the quarter to again push out to a 16-point lead, but I have to give credit to the Eagles as they continued to fight and not let their opponents kick away. They kicked the next 2 goals to be within 4 points in the latter stages of the third term, but a late Pies goal saw the Eagles face a 10-point deficit heading into the 3-quarter time break. However, the dam wall started to break in the final term, and Collingwood started to kick away. Now, granted, they could have put a bigger margin on the Eagles as they kicked 3 goals for in the last quarter, but in the end the Eagles fired their best shot, and Collingwood took all those punches and still were able to put a meaningful gap at the top of the ladder by 10 points. So Collingwood probably got the best of the Eagles tonight, and in the end still found a way to win. So if a team's going to be able to win a premiership, that's what they have to do, because most teams will put up their best fight against the top team. So well done to Collingwood to just take all those punches and still find a way to win. And West Coast, very good performance from them, but it's another loss, and they're still stuck at the bottom of the ladder. But getting to the statistics of this game, of course, on the multiple goal kickers for the Pies, Myercheck with the 2 goals along with Lipinski and Membry. For the Eagles, the sole multiple goal kicker was Tyler Brockman. On the disposals for the Pies, Nick Dacos 34, Josh Dacos 30, Pendlebury 28, 27 to Crisp, 21 to Long. For the Eagles, Baker with 35, McCarthy in his second game with 29 disposals, 27 to Hoff and Duggan, Hall with the 22. And finally on the AFL fantasy front for the Pies, Nick Dacos 137, Pendlebury 118, 107 to Crisp, 102 to Cameron and 100 to Sidebottom. And for the West Coast, Baker with the 117, Flynn 101, 99 to Duggan, 97 to Marek, and 95 to McCarthy. Now, my brother has given all the votes for the Saturday games. He has gone with, for the Pies v West Coast Clash, 3 votes to Scott Pendlebury, 2 votes to Nick Dacos, and the 1 vote to Liam Baker. So on Saturday evening, we head down to Tasmania for Hawthorn up against North Melbourne. Last time these two teams met down there, Hawthorn absolutely thrashed the Roos, and it was a pretty similar story this time around. The Hawks blitzed them in the opening term, and the game was pretty much done halfway through the second quarter, as the Hawks in the end ran out winners by 85 points, 150 to the Hawks, 65 to the Roos. Now, there was one injury concern from this one, unfortunately, for the young Roos star in George Wardlaw, who received an arm from Connor Nash in the second quarter, which connected with George's head, and unfortunately he was subbed out with concussion in the latter parts of the second term. And getting to the game itself, you could have been forgiven in thinking that the Hawks would have been a little bit slow coming off the bye. However, the opposite occurred. Hawthorn started brilliantly as they kicked 5 of the first 6 goals of the contest to put a handy break on their opponents. Now, they were dominant at stoppage, Hawthorn, and the Roos struggled to maintain the Hawks. But credit to North Melbourne, as they didn't let the margin blow out too much heading into the quarter time, as they only faced a 20-point deficit. However, it didn't take long for the Hawks to take full ascendancy, kick away in the second term. Again, Hawthorn kicked 5 of the first 6 goals in the second quarter, and at that point, the game was basically done. The Hawks were way too good, and the Roos really just sat on their morals and put a cue in the rack. At the main break, the Hawks led by 51 points, and the trajectory of this game continued down the same path in the second half. Hawthorn kicked 10 goals to North Melbourne's 4 throughout the second half of the game, and the only thing the Kangaroos could really take away from this matchup was the fact that they weren't beaten by over 100 points. But in the end, the Hawks got a nice percentage boosting win, while the Roos crashed back to earth. Really disappointing from North Melbourne. We saw last week them get a galvanising performance against the Blues, and I was really thinking this could be a danger game for Hawthorn coming off the bye, be a little bit sluggish. However, it was an absolute demolition job from Hawthorn. They went down to Tassie, absolutely beat up on North Melbourne, get a nice percentage boosting win, as I said, and North Melbourne really didn't put up a fight. It really does question where this club is at, because I think that we see a good performance from them every now and then. We think this team's finally coming up, and then they get a performance like this, and we just think, well, where are they? So I don't really know what to say about North Melbourne. I mean, they may get a few more wins this year, which is good, but they've got to stop having these sort of performances where they just get smashed by 60 plus points, because it's starting to get really embarrassing for a club that has been down the bottom for so many years. But let's move to the statistics of this game. Of course, on the multiple goal kickers for the Hawks, Jack Gunston with the 7 goals, 1 career high for him. Chol with the 5, 3 goals to Ramsden and Watson, 2 goals to McDonald and Ginnivan. For North Melbourne, the sole multiple goal kicker was Nick Larkey. On the disposals for Hawthorn, Amon with 33, 27 to Newcomb, 21 to Nash, 22 McKenzie and Ward. And for the Roos, McKercher with 34, 29 to Parker, 28 to David Juniak, 26 to Caleb Daniel, and the 20 to Harry Sheasel. And finally on the AFL fantasy front for the Hawks, Newcomb with 103 along with Carl Amon, 100 to Jack Gunston, Meek with the 99, Chol with the 97. And for the Roos, McKercher with the 103, Larkey with the 99, Parker with the 94, 93 to Cherry, and 91 to David Juniak. Now again, my brother's given the votes to this game. He has gone with 3 votes, Jack Gunston, 2 votes, Jai Newcomb, and the 1 vote to Mabior Chol. So we start on Saturday afternoon. The first game was the Gold Coast up against Melbourne. Melbourne having a pretty decent record up in the Gold Coast. However, the Suns finally getting back on the winners list this week with a 19-point victory. 104 to the Suns, 85 to the Demons. Now, there were a couple of injury concerns from this game. First of all, Blake Howes. He was forced off the ground in the second quarter after Ben Long landed on him in a contest, and unfortunately that resulted in concussion, seeing him being subbed out. And pretty soon after that, we saw Harrison Petty, who copped a hit to the head early in the second term when bending down to grab the footy, and unfortunately he failed his HIA and was ruled out soon after. But getting to the game itself, and it was an emphatic start from the Gold Coast Suns. They looked intent in trying to fix up their mistakes over the last few weeks. Granted, the Demons looked lethargic and disinterested in the opening term, but the Suns started well. However, they did miss some good chances early in the game, with the Gold Coast kicking 1 goal 5 in the first 15 minutes of the quarter, but it wouldn't take long for them to find the big sticks. And heading into the first break, the Suns finished with 12 scoring shots and 5 goals 7 to lead by 36 points. Now, Melbourne showed some respite early in the second term to kick their first goal, and they started to show a lot more fight than they did in the opening quarter. The pressure from the Demons lifted and the scoreboard started to tick over. Now, the Suns did well to keep a good gap on their opponents. However, after Melbourne were dominated in the first quarter, they brought the margin back to 24 points at the major break. But it seemed the Suns wanted to put the game to bed. Despite conceding the first goal of the second half, the quarter was largely dominated by the home side. The Gold Coast were leading most facets of the game in the quarter, and after kicking 6 goals to the Demons, 2 goals throughout the third term, heading into the final quarter, the Suns led by a very comfortable 46 points. Now, you would be forgiven in thinking that the game was done at that point. However, the Demons made an almighty charge in the final term. Melbourne kicked the first 4 goals of the final quarter and were within 19 points with about 5 minutes to go. However, the Demons would rue some gettable opportunities in the last quarter as they kicked 5 goals, 6 throughout the term, which is probably the major reason why the Suns were not hugely threatened in the final term. And the Gold Coast eventually did settle their nerves in the final moments, and after a tough month of footy, the Suns finally got back on the winners list. Well, this was a much needed win for the Gold Coast Suns. They do have a game in hand, but they want to try and consolidate that position in the top 8. And that win, I don't think it exactly locks them into finals, but they've got a couple of easy games in the later parts of the season. And now with a tough month coming up after the Essendon game, it is a good win the Gold Coast needed to get. So well done for them. And for Melbourne, very bad month of football, really. Around the bye, they've lost their last 4 games of football. And really, if they did show up in that first quarter, this game could have looked a whole lot different. However, the Suns really had this game won at the quarter time, and Melbourne fought their way through the game, but in the end, Gold Coast had this game won pretty convincingly. But let's move to the statistics of this game, of course. On the multiple goal kickers for the Suns, 3 goals to Ben King, 2 goals to Humphrey, Ainsworth, Long and Walter. For the Demons, Melksham with 5 goals, 6 in the end, Pickett with 3 and Fritsch with the 2. On the disposals for the Suns, Noble 29, Flanders 28, Anderson 27, Rao 24 along with Took Miller. And for the Demons, Petrarca 32, 27 to Rivers, 25 to Bowie, 25 to Pickett and 24 to Oliver. And finally, the AFL fantasy front for the Gold Coast, Noble and Rao both with the 107, 98 to Fiorini, 93 to Anderson and 90 to Flanders. And for Melbourne, Melksham 128, 105 to Petrarca, 101 to Pickett, 91 to Rivers and 89 to Salem. But now my brother has given the votes for this game. He has gone with 3 votes Jack Melksham, 2 votes Matt Rao and the 1 vote to John Noble. On Friday night, of course, it was the Swans up against the Dogs. 2 teams coming off big wins over the last week. However, it was the Bulldogs who held on in the final term in a tough contest to win by 9 points. 105 to the Dogs, 96 to the Swans. Now, there was one injury concern from this one, which was Dane Rampy. Unfortunately, he had an issue with his calf in the third term, and he was subbed out soon after that point. Really disappointing for the Swans after losing Tom McCartan before the game due to illness, so they were pretty hampered in their defence throughout the second half of this game. However, Dogs were still the better team, so let's get to the game. Now, despite the Dogs kicking the opening 2 goals of the contest, the Swans were seen up for the fight early. Their pressure was high and they soon responded with 2 goals of their own. However, after a pretty high-scoring opening quarter, the Dogs were the straighter kicking team and led by 3 points. And with the Bulldogs' accuracy continuing to be strong in the second term, they threatened to kick away as they kicked the first 4 goals of the quarter, while the Swans kicked 2 behinds in that period. But credit to Sydney, as they did rally late with the last 3 goals of the half to only face a 9-point deficit heading into the major break. And the Swans kicked the first 2 goals of the second half to make it 5 in a row, either side of the halftime siren, to take the lead for the first time since the opening term. But the game became an absolute goal fest in the third term with teams kicking goals for fun. However, it was the Dogs again who threatened to kick away as they kicked 4 goals in quick succession midway through the third term to take a 16-point advantage. But again, the Swans found something, and as they headed into the final change, being down by again 9 points, it set up for an interesting final quarter. And the Swans simply weren't going to let the Dogs run away with this game without a fight, as they kicked the opening goal of the quarter to be within 3 points. However, every single time the Swans looked to get close, the Dogs found a new gear. They kicked 2 of the next 3 goals to hold a 9-point lead once again. However, the Swans had a lot of chances to send a scare through the Doggies' camp, but something that eluded them throughout the entire game and most of last week was their set shot goal kicking. Sydney missed so many chances in the last 15 minutes to give themselves some meaningful belief, and in the end, the Swans kicked themselves out of the game, and the Dogs recorded a galvanising win in their finals race. So well done to the Dogs. They did very well throughout the night. They were challenged throughout a lot of it, but they did really well to stand up in some big moments, and it wasn't really their big stars that stood up today. We'll get to a couple of them in a moment, but really good performance from the Dogs, a real team performance, and Sydney, they just simply kicked themselves out of it. I mean, it was lucky last week against Port Adelaide they didn't have a real meaningful fight back from Port Adelaide, because I think they could have been challenged in that game too, and the Swans really only have themselves to blame. But let's move to the statistics of this game, of course. On the multiple goal kickers for the Swans, Heaney with 5 goals straight, Papley with the 2 goals won. For the Dogs, Frazier with 4, 3 goals to Norton and Darcy, 2 goals to Kennedy. On the disposals for the Swans, Goulden 30, 24 to Blakey, 23 to Grundy, 22 to Mills and Lloyd. For the Dogs, Bramble 28, 25 to Dale and Sanders, 23 to Fraser, and 21 to Harms. And finally on the AFL fantasy front, Brodie Grundy with the 137, Goulden 124, 117 to Heaney, 116 to Lloyd, even 100 to Blakey. And for the Dogs, Norton 121, 116 to Fraser, 104 to Bramble, 90 to Dale, and 86 to Bailey Williams. But now let's get to the votes for this game. 3 votes, Joel Fraser, 2 votes, Isaac Heaney, and the 1 vote to Brodie Grundy. Joel Fraser, what a performance. When a lot of their biggest stars didn't have a massive 4-quarter game. You're thinking of Darcy, Bontempelli, Liberatore. It wasn't really a lot of those names tonight. It was a lot more of the lesser lights. You're looking at Lockie Bramble, Riley Sanders, and the big guy, Joel Fraser, the mini Bond as they like to call him. 23 touches throughout the night, 7 marks, 3 tackles, and of course 4 goals. What a performance from him. Don't think many people would have seen that sort of performance coming, but Joel Fraser coming into his own this year, really good performance from him. Deserved the 3 votes. Isaac Heaney was one of the few players who actually looked competent inside the forward 50 for the Sydney Swans. 5 goals, 4 of them coming in the second half, was much needed for Sydney. So well done to Isaac Heaney. And Brodie Grundy is having one of the all-time seasons. I think there's a couple of ruckmen that probably have been a little bit more consistent, but over the last 6 or 7 weeks, Brodie Grundy I think has been one of the best ruckmen in the competition. He's really taking a more meaningful role in there in my opinion, and is probably in the best form of his career, which is pretty big to say because he's already got a couple of All-Australian jackets early in his career with the Pies. So Brodie Grundy just continues to elevate in his career. So the first game of the round, of course, was Port Adelaide up against Carlton. Both teams needing a big win after disappointing weeks the week before, but it was Port Adelaide who wanted to respond, and in the end, they won very comfortably by 50 points, 110 to the Power, 60 to the Blues. Now, there was one injury concern from this game, which was Adam Sard. He received a bump late in the second term, and he went down with a HIA. Unfortunately, he was subbed out of the game soon after that. Really disappointing there for Adam Sard, but really wasn't much concern on the scoreboard. Now, getting to the game itself, both teams were looking for a response after their losses in round 15. However, like I said, it seemed like only one team was up for the fight in the opening quarter, which was Port Adelaide. The Power absolutely blitzed Carlton in the first quarter. They kicked 5 goals to zip and led by 31 points at the first break. And the story ran a pretty similar path in the second quarter. The Power continued to dominate the territory battle, and the scoreboard began to look embarrassing for the Blues. Despite the Power missing a few chances in the second quarter, they still had their opponents goalless all the way until the last few minutes of the first half, as Carlton finally found their first goal through Lewis Young. And at halftime, Port Adelaide pretty much had the game done, leading by 46 points heading into the major break. And it seemed the Power didn't want to leave anything to chance early in the second half. They kicked the first 3 goals of it to put the game beyond doubt. Now, Carlton did okay to not let the margin blow out to something astronomical, but really, the game was all over after the first 25 minutes of the opening term. I could rattle off a few positives on Carlton's point of view in that second half, but really, it meant absolutely nothing. They were absolutely smashed, and in the end, Port Adelaide got a much-deserved win. So overall, Carlton, very poor performance. Embarrassing, I would say. They were looking for a response, and they got absolutely nothing in that first half. Couple of positives, like I said, that you could rattle off, but I don't think it really matters. They deserve to be smashed, and on Port Adelaide's point of view, they did well to respond. I said it in the tips this week. I think I trust them a little bit more being a response team, and that's what Port Adelaide did today, so well done to them. But let's move to the statistics of this one, of course, on the multiple goal kickers for the Power. Georgiades with the 5. He's in great form at the moment. Rioli with the 3. 2 goals to Burn Jones and Bergman. For Carlton, the sole multiple goal kicker was Fantasia with the 2 goals too. On the disposals for Port, Rosie and Butters both with the 30. Bergman 25, 22 to Richards and Farrell. For Carlton, 22 to Hewitt, 19 to Doherty, 18 to Haynes, Hollins and to Koning. And finally on the AFL fantasy front for the Power, Rosie and Bergman both with the 120. Farrell 94, 86 to Richards, 79 to Butters. And for Carlton, Doherty with the 93, 91 to Hewitt, 81 to Haynes and to Koning, and 77 to Charlie Curnow. But now let's get to the votes in this game. 3 votes, Mitch Georgiades, 2 votes to Connor Rosie, and 1 vote to Zach Butters. Georgiades, I think he's not being talked about enough right now as one of the better key forwards in the competition. He's had a 7-goal game in the last few weeks, had a 5-goal game today. He's 4th, I think, now in the Coleman race. He is having a very underrated season. For a team like Port Adelaide, who a lot of people have said has a very underperforming forward line, Mitch Georgiades is just finding goals every single week. I think he needs to be talked about almost in All-Australian squad discussions right now. He has had a very underrated season and deserves a lot of praise. Connor Rosie, since moving off of halfback, has been brilliant for the Power. 30 touches today, 11 marks. He's been very good, being a nice weapon off the halfback line. And Zach Butters did really well to fight through a tag from Chincotta tonight, and 30 touches for him, 12 score involvements, did really nicely there for the Power. But guys, thanks for watching this episode of The Review. I hope you did enjoy it. And if you want to listen to the the full episode, then make sure to go check us out on Spotify, as you can listen to the full episode there the morning after the round finishes. But that is all from me, guys. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did enjoy it. But for now, we'll catch you all in the next one.